Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of The Fire These Times. I'm your host, Ayman Makarem, and with me is Karena
Hi, everybody.
and Israa.
Hi, everyone.
And today we're joined by Dîlan, an organizer and reluctant academic, who's going to be talking about Kurdistan, but also about the recent statement by Öcalan, the kind of shocking, I don't know, thing that happened only a few days ago, wherein he, called for the disarmament of the PKK and laying down of arms and entering into a peace process with the Turkish state. It's huge. There's a lot to unpack. I think a lot of people have a lot of questions, and there's like much needed historical, political, geopolitical context, but also analysis. And so we have Dîlan to speak of it. And yeah, Dîlan, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hello, everyone. My name is Dîlan. I am, as Ayman said, a reluctant academic. I've spent the past decade or so organizing around the Kurdish liberation movement, mostly in the diaspora, and spending a lot of time researching and doing some academic writing, very little publishing for fear of state repression and restrictions on travel. And spent a lot of the last decade being incredibly frustrated, as I'm sure we're all very familiar with. And yeah, this has been, as soon as the statement was released, Ayman messaged me and was like, what is going on? Let's talk. And I'm happy to be joining you all. I don't claim to be an expert by any means, but an avid follower and obsessive, I think is probably the better word, obsessive follower of these developments, among others, of the party and the movement themselves. And yeah, hope I can contribute meaningfully.
Yeah. No, I'm excited. I think we're really going to cover a lot of ground, and especially because this only just happened, but also I think we're probably going to tackle this in a way that's different from most others in terms of, the Kurdish struggle being such a cornerstone or an important aspect of anti-capitalist, anti-colonial, anti-patriarchal, internationalist struggle. And Öcalan himself and his writings have been very important and especially for the internationalist left. And so, yeah, so let's get into it. Dîlan, could you give us a kind of overview of what's happened? What's the significance of the statement of not just the statement, now the PKK leadership themselves also called for a ceasefire or initiated
Mhm.
a ceasefire. Yeah, what's the sort of historical, political, I don't know, context of all of this? Yeah, go ahead.
I'll try my
Yeah.
best. Um, so on February 27th, there was a message released by Abdullah Öcalan. It was handwritten by Öcalan himself and was dated the 25th of February. The message was expected to be delivered by video, and a video was recorded. A delegation of politicians met with Öcalan on Imrallah Island in the prison where he's been in solitary for, I think, 25 years now. And the initial date for the release of the statement was February 15th, which marks the anniversary of Öcalan's capture in 1999. On that date, however, the democratically elected mayor of Van, a city now known as a Kurdish city, historically an Armenian and Kurdish city, was deposed and replaced by an appointee by the government. And there were a bunch of riots and hundreds of arrests. And so the statement was delayed. The statement that was released was read by two people. The statement that was released is called The Call for Peace and Democratic Society, and it was read by Ahmet Türk in Kurdish and Pervin Buldan in Turkish. Interestingly, the statement as it was live streamed by Turkish state media, the Turkish was read first, and when it came to the reading of the Kurdish statement, the audio was phased out, which is especially ironic given the content of the statement itself. Öcalan, the big surprise of the statement was that I guess surprise, was that he called on PKK leadership to lay down their arms and disband the group. And it's interesting that in some reporting of this, it is named as a call, and others it is a demand, and others it is a a must or a should. The phrasing of the translations has been really interesting. Someone probably will write about this at some point. And he began his message analyzing historical conditions that gave rise to the Kurdish question, talking about like the 20th century being marked by a lot of violence, and talks about the influence of socialist ideology on the PKK, and how the current peace effort is a continuation of a very old voluntary alliance between Kurds and Turks, and argued that the last 200 years or so, especially the modern Turkish Republic, have signify a marked departure from this historical trajectory. And I have thoughts on this idea of brotherhood that we can get into a bit later. He does suggest that the Republican era of Turkey is the phase in which capitalist modernity seeks to sever the historical Kurdish-Turkish alliance. And he portrays the relationship as a joint struggle against dominant forces, and calls for rebuilding this in the spirit of brotherhood. And the main task is to restructure this historical relationship, which has become extremely fragile, without excluding consideration for beliefs in the spirit of fraternity. The need for democratic society is inevitable. And he talks about how the PKK is the longest and most extensive insurgency and armed movement in the history of the Republic, and was primarily inspired by the fact that the channels of democratic politics were closed. So he does also talk about, and there's been some discussion and some, I don't want to say outrage, but some debate about this, like the phrasing of the next section, where he says that the inevitable outcome of extreme nationalist deviations, such as separate nation state, federation, administrative autonomy, or culturalist solutions, fail to answer the historical sociology of society. Respect for identities, free self-expression, democratic self-organization of each segment of society based on their own socioeconomic and political structures are only possible through the existence of a democratic society and political space. Fascinating to me is that a lot of the text that is published, or that was released, does talk about democracy and the historical context of the struggle, and all of the headlines talk about the disarmament and the disbanding, without really talking as much about the terms of it, or the reasons for the need for armed struggle, and then also the conditions for possibly ending armed struggle. And the sentence that has caused so much stir is the call made by Mr. Devlet Bahçeli, along with the will expressed by Mr. President and the positive responses from other political parties towards the known call, has created an environment in which I am making a call for the laying down of arms, and I take on the historical responsibility of this call. So it ending with all groups must lay down their arms and the PKK must dissolve itself. There was an additional note that Öcalan conveyed to the İmralı delegation that was not included in the published text. Undoubtedly, the laying down of arms and the dissolution of the PKK in practice require the recognition of democratic politics and a legal framework. This has been excluded from a lot of publications, which I find very interesting. But yeah, there were a lot of the responses that came after the initial statement were a lot of shock and recoil and possible outright rejection. I even saw some interesting posts on the internet of questioning if it was AI, if that was actually Öcalan. And people were like overanalyzing the image, saying, oh, the lines and the wall of the background don't match up. Why is he wearing red? His buttons don't match. The face doesn't look like his face. It looks like if you took a photo and put it into some app that ages your face, that's what you'd get. But it seems to be real, as much as we can take away that it is legitimate. And in response to this, the leadership of the PKK, the K&K released a statement today calling for a unilateral ceasefire, which is fascinating.
Yeah, there's a lot there. I think I should have broken it up into two questions because it was a bit unfair to bunch it all up. But thank you very much for that overview of the last 2, 3 days, which has been monumental. And yeah, there's a lot of questions and a lot of explorations of why now, of what does this really mean, of that there are some contradictions in the statement itself, where it's like usually this is something that comes after the establishment of a legal framework.
Hmm.
But regardless, before we get into all of that, could you situate this present moment within the historical context? Not necessarily, as Öcalan says, in the last 200 years of nationalism in the Turkish Republic, but I mean, at least, who are the PKK? Who is Öcalan himself? Why is he the sole prisoner in an island prison off of Istanbul? What is this 40-year-long struggle? Yeah, I think that's enough.
So Abdullah Öcalan is the leader of the Kurdistan Workers' Party, also known as the PKK, Partiya Karkarin Kurdistane. There are multiple leaders. He is a figurehead in a lot of ways and the ideological leader of the party. It started out as a student organization in Ankara in 1974. In 1979, they declared themselves the Workers' Party of Kurdistan. He himself was not in Ankara at the time of the initial formation of the PKK itself, but instead had relocated to parts of Kurdistan of Turkey, of Bakur, North Kurdistan, we call it, Bakur Kurdistan. And initially, it started out as a incredibly Marxist-Leninist party calling for an independent socialist Kurdistan. Military operations of the party began in 1984. In the years between 79 and 84, the party was trained, interestingly, by the DFLP, by Palestinian leftists, George Habesh's Communist Party in the mountains of Syria. They also spent some time in the Bekaa Valley in Lebanon, and were involved in the resistance to the Israeli invasion of Lebanon in 1981 and had some martyrs as well. The war against the Turkish state begins in 1984. The guerrilla forces of the PKK are known as the HPG, the HPG, the People's Defense Forces or Protection Forces, and they have waged war on the Turkish state for over 40 years now. And the party itself has taken many forms, and it would not be unfair to say that they have dissolved and reformed a number of times over the course of history. The leadership structure has changed a couple of times markedly, especially after Öcalan was captured in 1999, but even before that. And the different committees that are involved in decision making and the determining of the direction of the movement and of the party, it is an alphabet soup of acronyms and a very long timeline of dates of the changing of the party itself. Markedly in the early 2000s, the ideological orientation of the party took a very hard turn. One of the things I find the most fascinating about the PKK and Öcalan ideologically is the willingness to engage in self-critique and to work on change and admit shortcomings and admit faults, and learn from the past as well and acknowledge that. The practice of self-critique that they have is in a lot of ways still very Leninist, but has been adapted in some interesting ways, the process of tekmil. In the early 2000s, a shift away from a socialist state happened towards what we know as democratic confederalism. A lot of this came out of Öcalan's prison writings, where he engaged very extensively with the work of Murray Bookchin, who is what's a nice way of putting this? Murray Bookchin was a very disillusioned anarchist from Vermont, who had a lot of libertarian anarchist, and in a traditional libertarian sense, not in a shitty Republican libertarian sense. Very much pro high levels of civic engagement on a very local level, as opposed to larger overarching government structures that are mostly bureaucratic nonsense and also a heavy arm of state and control. So democratic confederalism comes out of Murray Bookchin's concepts of social ecology. And this, I mean, a lot of the talks around this also caused some division within the party, a lot of discussions within the party, but that shift was slowly implemented. And we have, and we see the change in ideological practice of the party when it comes to organizing communities in ways that they had not done before, to the same extent. And the ways that they organize them, very ground up, developing sort of commune systems, interesting dual power formations within Turkey, as far as like interesting dual power formations that other people have written about very extensively. David Graeber has some interesting writings on the dual power formations of democratic confederalism as implemented in Northeast Syria, from written while and after he visited there about 10 years ago. Yeah, so this war against the Turkish state has been ongoing. The PKK, actually originally the Apocular, the followers of uncle of Abdullah Öcalan, were declared a terrorist organization in 1979. The Turkish state did not actually know the name of the party at the time, but just declared Apocular, the followers of Apo, as terrorists. And as I'm sure we are all aware, the designation of terrorist is very arbitrary and very much determined by those in power. And there are different ways to define and understand what terror is. One could argue that the violence of the state against civilians is also terror, but not a lot of people do, unfortunately. So some of the background to this is there have been repeated attempts at a peace process with the PKK. So the first time that a unilateral ceasefire was declared by the PKK was in March of 1993. The process collapsed after the then Turkish president Turgut Özal died, and he had been supporting the peace efforts. Some people say that the deep state assassinated him when he was in the hospital. In 1999, the ceasefire declaration was renewed, and the ceasefire continued until 2004 without achieving any real tangible progress politically. And then in July of 2010, some secret negotiations took place between the PKK and the Turkish state in Oslo, but no results really came of that either. Between 2012 and 2013, peace talks were held again with Abdullah Öcalan after he called for a peaceful resolution to the Kurdish issue. He made this call on Kurdish New Year's Day on March 21st. Despite some progress that was initially made, the process collapsed in 2015 when Erdogan declared war against the Kurds. So some of the context for the existence of the PKK as a national liberation movement initially, and then a more holistic, not nationalist liberation movement later. As I'm sure we are familiar, the hegemonic nationalism of the modern nation state does not really allow for many different kinds of freedoms, but particularly those of minority populations, ethnicities, linguistic groups, religions, et cetera, et cetera. And the largest minority existing in Turkey now are the Kurds, numbering between 25 to 35 million, possibly more. The advent of the Turkish nation state was a century ago, more than a century ago, and began itself with genocide at the sort of end days of the Ottoman Empire. We see the Armenian genocide. And so much of the existence of modern nation states is really dependent on violence as a means of control, and the state as the arbiter of violence, as the sole arbiter of violence, and the sole determining factor of who gets to exist as individuals or as ethnicities or as cultures. And if your identity goes against the narrative of the nation state, then it is otherized and also deemed a threat to the state itself, a threat to the very fragile sense of national identity that is very much constructed because states did not exist before. The introduction of the nation state paradigm to the Middle East was absolutely a colonial introduction and interference. And thus we see very violent constructions of hegemonic nation state identities in the 20th century. hence a lot of the violence that we see against minorities, and that was referenced by Öcalan in the statement. As a result of this formation of the Turkish state under Atatürk, we see the declaration of Turkish as a national language, and the implicit and explicit exclusion of any languages other than Turkish, including Kurdish. And of course, as we are wont to do, there were a series of uprisings in Turkey by Kurds of different areas, not super unified, but over the course of 20, 30 years of the initial establishment of the state, and were very, very harshly cracked down on. And there were a series of massacres against Kurds in the 30s and 40s. The language obviously was banned, and the legal status of the language has like technically changed in the past 10 years. It is no longer technically illegal to have like a cassette tape of Kurdish music, as it once was. However, as recently as a year ago, you see reports of people, including like an old man speaking on the phone in Kurdish, getting beaten up by nationalists and hospitalized. And I think even some murders in the past year as well. So the goal of the PKK as it formed, of an independent socialist Kurdistan, very much influenced by the like socialist internationalism of the time, of the era of the 1970s, was also very much influenced by the necessity for self-advocating for the Kurdish liberation, freedom to speak their own language, practice their own cultural traditions, which were also banned. And when left no other option, armed resistance is the voice of the oppressed.
Wow. Okay. Thank you so much for that. I had been writing down questions as you were speaking, but then you just kept answering the questions. So I've got nothing left. I think if there's one last thing that I think, because obviously there's a lot of reasons that the Kurdish struggle is so fascinating, but also important for those on the left. For me, as someone from the Levant, from the region, who, as a Lebanese whose state emerges from, the Ottoman Empire as well, and with this advent of these nation states, that like Kurdish nationalism, or in a broader sense, the Kurdish struggle, is one of the sort of like most explicit ruptures or continued manifestations of the First World War. And I see this a lot in my own like readings of Lebanese history and the entire region. Like, why these borders? And so why these borders becomes a very interesting question, especially when it's like borders, national borders that literally cut completely sort of more organic, whatever ethnic formations. And so Kurdistan, as again, not necessarily in this sort of, but Kurdish speaking areas straddle 4 different nation states:
Mm-hmm.
Syria, Iraq, Turkey, and Iran.
Mm-hmm.
And so maybe this would be way too much to jump into, but the kind of unifying idea of this idea of Kurdistan, of the kind of, despite those splits, or maybe rather in spite, but I think that's maybe a bit too deep, because I don't actually have a specific question. It's just like a kind of comment of like, yeah, these essentially neo-colonial nation-state borders are horrible for many reasons, and within the Kurdish question, because it's literally bisects. Yeah.
I think there's a lot of pushback against this idea of like the Kurdish question or the Kurdish issue, because it's often called that in Turkey. Same with the Cyprus problem. But the Kurdish question, or the existence of Kurds within modern nation-state borders, I think speaks a lot to the idea of peripheries. Kurds exist in the peripheries of the nation state, and also in the peripheries of how we understand national liberation movements, because there isn't just advocacy for the liberation of like one area, but rather 4. And that is very difficult for a lot of people to understand, because it threatens the territorial integrity of 4 nation states, not just one. And it is not very clear cut, because it is very much, separatist. And I've seen a lot of news reports talking about separatist jailed leader Abdullah Öcalan, Interestingly, even though for the past almost 20 years, or more than 20 years, Öcalan himself has not been advocating for separatism, but rather for a democratic nation within Turkey that enshrines rights for Kurds that they have been denied for the past 100 years. Um, Kurds exist on the periphery not only of these nation states and of their historiographies and the way they're talked about, and language domination and other understandings of what nationalism is, but also on the peripheries of diaspora solidarities. And there are interesting Kurdish solidarity groups, but are often a question mark when it comes to the clear-cut sort of campism that we see resurging, of the East versus West, because Kurds don't quite fit into either. They're not on the eastern side or the western side, but some kind of third way. And there has been some interesting writing about the third way, or a different method that doesn't quite engage with the oftentimes far too clear-cut understanding of what the evil versus good is, because honestly they all suck. But I also want to push back a little bit against this idea of congruent Kurdish territories, because I must say that a lot of Kurdish territories in modern Turkey were also inhabited by a lot of Armenians who have been expelled from the place. It was not just Kurdish land. And I think the idea of land belonging to people is not the way that I want us to be relating to land, and to it as territory to be owned by a particular group of people and thus not owned by others, but rather land that is to be tended to, that gives us life and that we live with and not just on or from. And it doesn't necessarily belong to Kurds in the way that we understand the state talking about narratives of owning land, but rather this is land where Kurds live and have lived, and this is land where Armenians have lived and should live again. And there's a bunch of funny internet memes about calling most of Anatolia Western Armenia, um, which honestly, why not?
I'm sure Karena
But
has a lot to add on this point. I just want to
Yeah, I
say
just
before you do, I did regret my phrasing as it was coming out of my mouth. I was just trying to
okay.
not focus on Kurdistan, because I know that's in that language of there is a thing called Kurdish, that's, so I was trying to find a way of phrasing, I don't know, anyway,
Mm.
without sort of localizing it in a idea of creating a separate state, because I know that's not the main tendencies. But either way, so yes, I also do hate, I mean, the Palestinian question or the Palestinian problem, or then going
Mm.
further back, the Jewish question. These are terrible, terrible just ways of even framing these things. But yeah, Karena, go ahead.
yeah, I just wanted to comment, or I don't know, maybe bring up some further questions we can discuss, but regarding the kind of moving beyond the nation state structures, and kind of envisaging ways of being together in kind of multi-ethnic, multi-confessional societies. And I think especially since the 1990s, from the Armenian perspective, at least, which is, the perspective I'm kind of looking at this, it's freedom wasn't defined within, nation state boundaries, but rather through kind of these democratic societies and movements like, Xinjiang, Azadi. These were transnational, or this was, a transnational social movement that emerged from, a militant organization like the
Mhm.
PKK, which mobilized, in different contexts. Um, and despite, these successive episodes of violence, kind of gave entire populations a way to survive politically and socially. And what's I found so interesting, also from a social movement perspective, is how flexible it's been in finding answers in different times of upheaval, that kind of strengthen society in this kind of, reflexive way of and on the micro level, the self criticism, but on a more macro level, finding new ways of adapting to changing contexts. And I guess, in my mind, one question, given this current call for peace, is to what extent is this like a historical continuation of that past? Is it just another adaptation, or is this going to mean kind of a break? Which is, to be honest, like my kind of initial emotional reaction to it was like, oh no, is this a break rooted in kind of pragmatic considerations of survival for the movement, or is this and I think this is probably a work in progress, like what I'm talking about. This is like, I think I'm seeing slowly more like articulations of how we could see this, what it could be, what the challenges, opportunities are of this. And I think there's a lot that remains unseen yet, but it is clear that this is a really kind of um, important time of change and flux, and it can be anxiety inducing to think what this means for the struggle moving forward. Um, and I wanted to mention another anxiety I have about it is that I think when I said that it can feel like a loss, the movement's been so important for other peripheral, quote unquote, nations like Armenians. And the fact that the Kurdish movement and its recognition of the Armenian genocide, together with this struggle for Kurdish rights, especially within Turkey, and the possibility for real democracy in Turkey, which is very kind of not obviously not happening now, but maybe 15 years ago, that those three were really intimately intertwined. And there was a lot of memory work that was done within Kurdish communities related to the Armenian genocide that became kind of almost like mainstreamed in the Kurdish public sphere in recent years. And it just showed how possible it was, like, in this like post genocidal context, to have not maybe a directly perpetrated group, but a group that benefited from the genocide, kind of coming to terms with it and working with Armenians to kind of rehabilitate memory with regards to the events of 1915. And it just was a model for what could be that was so inspiring. And it's stuff like that that I hope finds a way of persisting through these new formations that we'll be seeing.
Mm-hmm. There is a lot of historical solidarity between the PKK and the Armenian struggle, not just in the context of the genocide, but also Monte Melkonian hung out with the PKK for a while in Syria and Lebanon. And there's some interesting memories of his that have been in his brother's book, In My Brother's Road, where he talks about his time with the PKK. Side note, and this maybe doesn't need to be in the actual released podcast, Monte is like one of my personal heroes. The
Same.
Yeah. Monte Melkonian really, to me, embodies an inspiration as far as like true internationalist solidarity, and like commitment and dedication to not just a single cause, but to like the broader cause of liberation for oppressed peoples across the world. And I think, I mean, I know that I'm not the only one who's been inspired by that, not the only Kurd who's been inspired by that, but I also know that that was like very much seen and recognized by the party.
Who is this person? Can you say his name?
Monte Melkonian.
Okay. Could you say a bit more? I've never heard of this person, actually. It sounds fascinating.
He was born to like third generation Armenian parents in Visalia, California. It's like farmland. Ended up going to UC Berkeley, where he learned Armenian at the university, and like really got in touch with his heritage in a way that he had not been able to in his childhood. Studied archaeology, got a like full ride to I think Oxford or Cambridge to do a PhD. But it was like the 80s, and Artsakh was coming under attack, and he like left and went and fought and traveled around and was like hanging out with leftists in Iran and the Mujahideen in Afghanistan and with like the PKK and the like Palestinian, the PFLP and DFLP in Lebanon and Syria. He like really was a true internationalist.
Damn. Israa, I feel like you probably have a lot.
Yeah, so what this is bringing up for me right now is one of the questions about like I mean like on the Turkish side of things, the negotiator is from the right wing parties of Turkey, right? And so it's like and Turkey, we're seeing this like over the last few years with the rise of migration and their desire to become part of the EU and using migrants as a bargaining chip, this rise of fashion, like ethno nationalism, and whether it's like the Kurds or the Syrians or Palestinians or any of the minorities in the state, like this is something that like is missing for me in the statement, right? Because it's talking about the relationship between the Kurds and the Turks, which is obviously very important and has a long history, but so has all these other identities, and we're not engaging in that conversation.
Mhm.
And and it's kind of it's interesting to me that Erdogan, right, has kept his distance from this. And the person again is who's leading this is from the right wing party. And so like going to that internationalist question, because you're right, Delena, like Öcalan and the Kurdish movement is one of the few examples, like the Zapatistas, of leftist internationalism, anti-capitalism, anti-state that is truly experimenting with alternative ways of being, that not only in organizing society, but in the self-reflection piece that you brought in, right? Like, so starting with the self and what we have been conditioned to and how to decondition ourselves so that we could relate to each other in new ways and build new societies and new ways of relating and being. And this is one of the things like that's I've been sitting with over the last few days with this statement, or really is like, what does this do to what does it do to our larger movements when we have such an active experiment, and now we're saying, hey, let's integrate into the state. There's other ways of doing this. And especially when, I mean, I don't know of an example, maybe you know, but I don't know of an example of a nation state with power the way Turkey has, actively willing to give up its power to make space for those that it's been oppressing. And so, what does that do to our movements? What does that do to our way? Is it like I don't want to say giving up, because I don't think it is. I do think like Öcalan has shifted his strategies and tactics, and the movements has shifted over its existence. And I think that's why it's continued to survive. And I think it's important. But I also don't believe in reform. And I don't see how we could integrate with an entity that doesn't necessarily still want us. Like, right? Like we've seen all these statements coming out from the Kurdish side, and we've seen some acknowledgments on the Turkish side, but even on the Turkish side acknowledgments, it's been like, oh, here's who should be dealing with it, right? It hasn't been here's what we should all be doing, which is the opposite of what we're seeing on the Kurdish side. The Kurdish side statements that I'm seeing is all like, this is all our responsibilities. We all need to be part of this. We all have to make this happen. On the Turkish side, we're seeing, well, it's the parliament. Maybe it's this party. Maybe they should be doing it, right? So I don't know if I guess I want to hear your reflections on this, because this is one of the tensions I'm kind of struggling with. And right, full transparency, like I've been going through my own emotions with this announcement of like what you're saying, like there's the denial. Is like, is this real? I definitely had, as soon as I saw it, I was like, how do we know if it's real? How do we, like, they don't show his video. They don't show, like, don't even allow the video to be shown. How do we know it's not a setup? How do we know? And the more I read into it, the more I see, especially the analysis from Kurdish movement leaders, the more I do believe it's real. But also like I try, I'm struggling seeing the long vision and how this actually takes us to the next step.
Yeah, I've also been going through a roller coaster of emotions since the statement was released. I think one thing to keep in mind is that the fact that he was unable to deliver the speech by video really speaks to how much every statement that is released from İmralı has to be approved by the Turkish state, if not Erdogan himself. So we will do with that information as we will. And Öcalan has been kept under like incredibly strict control. He's been in solitary confinement for 25, 26 years now. And I think some of the answer to this speaks to Karena's question about, is this just a continuation of this like rebirthing process and reforming process that the PKK has undergone a couple of times throughout its history, somewhat similar to a phoenix rising from ashes, of a like, is this the next chapter? This does seem to be the next chapter, but we don't know what it will look like, as we've never known.
Yeah.
But this feels particularly, I think, terrifying in a lot of ways, because often laying down arms when armed struggle is the only tool you have against your oppressor can feel like certain death. And I don't remember who it was who said this, but there was some quote, probably some pithy Instagram quote about freedom never being voluntarily given by the oppressed, but it must be demanded and often fought for by the oppressed. Or freedom never being given by the oppressor, but often it must be demanded and fought for by the oppressed. And when you lose your chip of how you fight and bargain for that, how you fight for that, not necessarily bargain, how you fight for that, what's left is bargaining. And the history of bargaining between the PKK and the Turkish state has not ever really gone well. So that feels particularly terrifying, of a like, well, if all we have are talks, and now it is in like the ball is in the Turkish state's court, essentially, to respond to this in a way that actually listens to and reflects the call of the statement and the demands, repeated, like very clearly articulated demands of the party and of Öcalan over the past many years. It can feel a bit terrifying to think that the future lies in the hands of a like genocidal state that has not ever really treated minorities or Kurds or anyone they deem a terrorist or a threat to like their existence as a nation state well at all. So yeah, the responses to the statement initially were, I think, very much driven by this like emotional like gut reaction of like fear and like recoil of like, no, why would you do that? But also, this war has been going on for 40 long years, longer. And people are exhausted. I mean, the guerrillas are exhausted. They are fighting a thankless war. They are fighting and dying repeatedly. They're not getting paid for this. This is a like lifetime commitment. And if this is like the next chapter, and if there is, you know, some kind of consensus from the KNK that this is like the next step that they're willing to try at the very least, then we can hold our breaths and cross our fingers and hope and pray for the best, I guess. It does make us feel a little bit powerless, but we were powerless to begin with. I mean, I'm not on the front lines. But oh, there was something else I was going to say that I forgot.
Can I jump in
Yeah,
with
please.
something? And then like if you remember, let me know. I can pause as well. I think I really appreciate you mentioning, the fact that people are tired, guerrillas are tired. It is thankless and grueling. I wanted to go back a little bit to the timing of this and the kind of more like, and then we can come back to this this aspect, the more like Kurdish political movement as a whole. So the timing, what sort of observers, analysts are saying, Erdogan is about to be termed out of office, and according to the Turkish constitution, he can't run in 2028. And what autocratic regimes do is what they do, and they prioritize ensuring regime longevity. And Erdogan doesn't have the necessary votes in parliament to either call early elections or draft a new constitution. So he could use the support of the pro-Kurdish party in parliament. But I think there's more at stake. And I hope this is something we can kind of touch on, is like, PKK disarmament for Erdogan could help him end its offshoot in the Democratic Autonomous Administration of Northeast Syria. He's long pushed for disbanding it, has pressured the US to stop supporting it. He also wants to strengthen economic ties with Iraq. And, Iran is kind of weakened at the time. So this is kind of an opening, right? So it seems that Erdogan's simultaneous negotiation with, not Erdogan's, but the Turkish state's negotiation with Öcalan and, repression of these like pro-Kurdish political movements overall fit into this broader strategy, perhaps. Like, it's obviously not I don't think, any of us would think that this is a genuine attempt at conflict resolution from the Turkish side. But, just kind of a convenient time to weaken the Kurdish political agency, perhaps, while allowing Erdogan to strengthen his own position. But I think something that kind of sticks in my mind, something maybe, is worth looking out for is delegitimization of Kurdish political movements overall by Turkey, right? I kind of see this in this way, like by negotiating with Öcalan while Turkey's simultaneously removing elected Kurdish officials from eastern cities and labeling pro-Kurdish activists as terrorists. Ankara is kind of reinforcing this propaganda that, the real quote unquote Kurdish issue is terrorism, not political rights, not self-determination, which would marginalize these legal Kurdish political participation, these mayors and other leaders, municipal leaders, and justifying further crackdowns. So it's that kind of control over that peace narrative that I'm kind of concerned about, how it ends up shaping how broader audiences see this. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point, Karina, especially when you right, the negotiation process could be with the people on the streets right now engage in this stuff, but instead you're going to the symbolic head. Öcalan has been in prison for how many years now? He has not been on the front line. And while, yes, he still has major influence on the party and the thought process and the development of the movement, he's not on the streets with those actively engaged in the struggle right now. And Delena, when you were talking about the how long he's been under not only imprisonment but solitary confinement and just the strict control over who he engages with and how he engages with the world. I mean, that for me also leads to the questions of what does that do to a person? And we know self-reflection is important. And obviously, we see it in his writing. And I'm not taking away any of that stuff. He's been incredibly influential to me and my way of thinking. But also, when you're separated in that way, that does have its own influence, right? And for this state power, this authoritarian state power with that is top down and in the way it's organized to only be dealing with who they've deemed as the symbolic head of the movement or the party and basically ignoring everyone else is in itself a contradiction to what the party stands for and what the movement stands for. And it's been something, honestly, a critique for me in the movement for a while, because while the movement is very much about democratic confederalism and horizontal organizing and distribution of power and engaged in deep critique of this, Öcalan is still put at this pedestal. And that never leads to anywhere good,
I mean, he is very much an ideological leader. And after past statements about the reorganizing of the party, there are, I don't know if conferences are the right word, but decisions are made by the existing leadership structure that are not in prison, the KCK. And it is still a question of will they actually lay down arms? There has been a call for a ceasefire, but not actually for laying down arms. And there was some chatter on the internet of, the decision to actually lay down arms will have to be made in a democratic way by a convening of the party and of the guerrillas. One of the things that was called for is that Öcalan be present at those meetings, physically present. So one of the conditions of this meeting happening, and thus also the decision to lay down arms, will be the release of Abdullah Öcalan.
Yeah.
Interestingly, the day of or after the statement, Central Committee member Murat Karalyan, let me try that again. Interestingly, the day that the statement was released, PKK Central Committee member Murat Karalyan released a statement saying that the movement will not lay down its weapons until the leader Öcalan is free. that the Kurds have been deceived many times in their past and harbor deep distrust of the Turkish state. The language of the state must change to one of peace and trust building before progress can be made. Important to note here that Turkey has used the concept of peace as a way of sort of silencing legitimate demands for political and social and cultural rights, saying, well, we need to achieve like peace and the end to the war before we can even talk about those things. And only Öcalan has the authority to call for disarmament, but the decision will be made democratically, and that a bilateral ceasefire, not just a unilateral call, is necessary before disarmament can be discussed. So the PKK has called for a unilateral ceasefire on their end and are waiting for the bilateral ceasefire to be called, so waiting for Turkey to respond in kind. And the co-chair, the female co-chair of the KCK, Bese Hozat, released a statement the same day, talking about the conditions of security, health, freedom, and work must be created for Abdullah Öcalan. Without these conditions, he won't be able to play his role in making appeals to society. Can he even make an appeal under conditions of isolations? Would such an appeal have any legitimacy under these conditions? How can one expect such a thing under conditions of isolation and torture? And must be added that any statement that is released must be approved by the state, and that the lifting of his isolation must be officially confirmed, and a law must be passed in parliament for this. So it's not that they're agreeing to disarm. I think that's important to understand from the statement of today. The call for a ceasefire is not an agreement to disarm. It is a step in the process of this like new chapter of how they are engaging with the Turkish state.
I think it's also important to like add that even with this unilateral ceasefire, they're also saying like, yes, we won't attack, but if we will, in self-defense. So they're still
Exactly.
holding the self-defense line.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Which is good. That's allaying some of the fears of going from past experiences with the Turkish state of like disarming in the 30s and then being met with massacres.
Mm-hmm.
And it is very much so, sorry, just to jump back in, it is still an open conflict. I think it doesn't get reported enough at all, especially like European media kind of avoids it because obviously they have this like special relationship with Turkey. But I think, I don't know if this is a story I saw on your Instagram, Dîlan, but there were like attacks today or yesterday by the Turkish state that martyred several people.
Yeah, particularly in Rojava. Turkish airstrikes have not stopped at all. Daily airstrikes. In the narrative of the Turkish state that the SDF is an extension of the PKK, they push that very strongly to justify their aggression on the border and beyond the border. And this is the narrative that justified on their end the invasion of Afrin in 2018 and the Operation Olive Branch or whatever the fuck they called it in 2019 and the establishment of the 30-kilometer buffer zone, the occupation basically of that land. I think one of the questions when it comes to media literacy for the general population is like, how willing are we to, as a whole, we as a whole, I don't mean we as us, we as a whole to reject state narratives or like question them a bit more. Because so much of how the PKK is talked about in global media, in European media, and is directly from the mouth of the Turkish state.
I will add to that also Al Jazeera,
Oh God, yeah, the
which I think,
Qataris are horrendous.
Definitely.
which is important to note because I think in the context of Palestine, like a lot of people who are sort of new to all this see Al Jazeera as like, yes, very much so, much better than any of the American whatever when it comes to Palestine. When it comes to a lot of the region, but it has its, I'm not going to call it blind spots. It has its ideological whatever, or like political. And so like even reading in these statements, like how they describe the PKK, again, in the same way when we do media analysis of like the New York Times, like the first thing they say about the PKK, the outlawed PKK. And then like
Separatist, terrorist.
separatists, yeah.
Yeah.
Starting with the statements from Erdogan and then later on with like some other stuff like burying the lead or whatever. I think my only reflection at this point from in this conversation that I can bring in is just this like the use of this concept of the peace process which we've grown up with. I don't know, like I've just always heard of the peace process. It's only until I was like reading more like when this term came about in the 80s, again, vis-a-vis Palestine,
Hmm.
from Edward Said's descriptions of it as it's like a new thing. Like now they're talking about this like this new construction, the peace process. And I find that very interesting because it's bullshit when we've always known it's bullshit. But it's a yeah, the fear is that it's a as we've seen with Palestine, it's a tool to just continue the project of colonialism, of ethnic cleansing, of building so-called Greater Israel, having this rhetorical device. Oh, there's a process.
Mm.
And so I think that's where a lot of people are a bit shocked, where it's like, okay, there has to have been concessions in some of these like discussions. What those concessions are, it's not clear, right?
Hmm.
To be taking such a huge decision. So I don't know. It's just because yeah, a lot of the things that they're now stating, like those are kind of the preconditions usually for then, okay, now that that's established, now we will call for a laying down of arms.
Yeah, I mean, did anyone really think that the Turkish state would allow Öcalan to like send a like morale boosting statement to like the Kurdish fighters?
Right.
Or like to declare renewed war against the Turkish state? I mean, like there's no way that would happen either.
Yeah.
So like it's kind of an of course that like the statement from him would call for some kind of peace. Uh, I don't think that there was a lot of expectation that he would call for complete disarmament. However, and it was asked, how did we get here and like why now? It's a bit of a timeline on those things. So in December of last year, the Dem party, formerly the HDP, was able to visit Abdullah Öcalan in prison. And it was the first time that anyone from the party, Dem or the predecessor HDP, had been able to visit him in almost 10 years. So like the last time that they met with him was like April of 2015. And before that, there had been no contact with him by his family for about 18 months until like March of 2024. There were questions of like, is he alive? Did he survive COVID? And so after the meeting of his family in March of 2024, the party was able to arrange a meeting with him in December. And around the same time, Devlet Bahçeli, the leader of the MHP, the far-right Turkish Nationalist Party, one of them, but the big one, the Nationalist Movement Party or whatever, suggested that the release of Öcalan could be negotiated if there was a call for disarmament of the PKK. So the subsequent talks of the Dem Party with Öcalan in December and February, or in January and February after this December 28th meeting, and then subsequent meetings with like different Kurdish parties across the Middle East. Like I remember seeing on the news that they were in Erbil like 2 weeks ago, the Dem Party, and that they were like meetings with ANES and all these things. The tone for those meetings was very likely set by the statement of Bahçeli. It is interesting, as so you mentioned that like Erdogan has stayed completely out of this and is like letting the MHP sort of like be the voice of the like Turkish nationalists when it comes to dealing with Öcalan. But as for like how we got here, that's a bit of the timeline if that's helpful. And then I also think that something that has influenced Öcalan absolutely in like the statement and these decisions come from his statements after the December meeting. And there was like a 7-point democracy statement that was released. I don't know what the exact translation to English would be. And the general framework of his ideas talked about, even then in December, talked about the reestablishment of the bonds of brotherhood between Kurds and Turks, and that it's necessary for all political parties in Turkey to take the initiative and act constructively, and that the Parliament of Turkey like plays a big role in this. And he says that the developments and events in Gaza and Syria have shown that solving this problem, which is being tried by external imposition, has become like a gangrene, has become like a sort of rotting destruction and death, and has reached a situation that cannot be postponed. With the seriousness and in order for fair and balanced action to succeed, the contributions and proposals of the opposition are also important. So he is somewhat aware of like what is going on and was like briefed about what is happening in Syria and Gaza at the very least. Um, and he also talks about the how this is an important direction to take for democratic transition. And that his this delegation will share his ideas with the state and responsible office and political parties, and he stands ready to take the necessary positive steps in advocacy, and that this is a time of peace, democracy, and brotherhood for Turkey and the region. And another thing that I think was mentioned is the timing of this with regards to what's happening in Syria and with the Kurds in Syria, and the continued aggression of Turkey in Kurdish areas of Syria and their insistence that the SDF is a branch of the PKK, which they are not explicitly, is possibly contributing to this as well. If there is some bilateral ceasefire is declared, that would hypothetically, theoretically end the aggressions against civilians in northern Syria as well.
Yeah, my mind is going to like Turkey as an empire, right? And we know that the Northeast Syria, the Democratic Confederacy of Northeast Syria, has been a lot like is allies with the U.S. uh against ISIS during the battle, and with the fall of Assad, there's been talks with the Zionist entity, right? And so like this does put more different pressure on Turkey as its own empire, and basically using that getting the Kurds in line tactic to close that line off, which I mean, there's lots of critiques on that, and I don't on many different levels. And while yeah, I understand the necessity to protect and to find alliances, and like I definitely am someone who's like, okay, constantly be reassessing your tactics and your strategies. And if in a moment you have to align with your enemy to get you through your more severe enemy, that's like the more deadly enemy that's right in front of you, and then and reassessing from there. But yeah, so I think it's really, we're seeing like these shifts in the geopolitics of the area that are a lot more nuanced than I think we ever really expected, I guess, or really kind of showing how ugly this stuff could get, right? There is no clean way. There is no right or wrong. There is no black and white. And I'm just really stuck on like the consolidation of power on the Turkish state. And while that would be great against the Zionist entity and against the American empire, but what does that actually still also do to our bigger movements? And if we empower one empire in order to destroy another, how do we break that cycle? This is where my mind keeps going to, you know?
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah. I mean, I had a couple people reach out to me that I didn't have the bandwidth to respond to when there were reports of the ANES like having phone calls with the Israeli state. And I think one thing to keep in mind there is the ideological lines that we have the privilege of drawing and upholding in the diaspora and in
Yep.
the West, of
Yep.
like being able to choose to like boycott and call for divestment,
Yep.
and like not buy Israeli products and not engage with that, is not an option for people who face death, like certain death at the hands of like
Absolutely.
one genocidal state versus another.
Right.
Um,
Right.
and in the face of going on more than 100 years of like anti-Kurdish sentiment that has been embedded in different iterations of nationalism in Syria and Turkey and Iran and Iraq, there is no one that they can turn to.
Right. Right.
And the US is a very fickle ally and a shitty ally for many reasons beyond them being an imperial power. But when it came to like fighting ISIS, the ideological or moral question of like accepting help from the empire or dying at the hands of Daesh was like not
Yeah.
really a question.
Right. Absolutely.
Like you take the help that you can get, and the like critiques or the like gotcha moments I've had thrown at me by Western anti-imperialists of a like, well, they accepted help from like the West or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
really begs the question of are we calling for people to like die on some ideological hill that you determine?
Right, right, absolutely. Yeah, and I think this is like the strategy and tactics question becomes so vital, and it's one again like one of these movements that I really see struggle with this because I agree with you. Like, and we saw the same thing within Syria, right? Like you have an immediate death threat. And while this other shitty entity exists and also impacts your life, this other one is literally in your face, threatening everything that you know.
Yeah. In the
And
face of
so,
Syria, or in the case of
yeah,
Syria, for the Kurds, you have multiple immediate death threats: Turkey, the
exactly.
FSA, the SNA, and ISIS.
Right, right. Yeah. And so, yeah. And like, yeah, I think this is where the nuance becomes so important. And I don't think most of us could hold these nuances because you're right. Like, I've had many arguments with, especially within the Palestine movement in the US, where it's like, oh no, you can't trust the Kurds and you can't trust this or you can't trust Syria. It's all part of the imperial hegemonic power and it's all against, like, it's the empire and their CIA movements and all that bullshit. But it's not. It's not that. It's not that simple.
No.
Like it actually gives too much power to these entities and completely removes the actual liberation movements themselves and the people involved and the people on the ground who are experiencing the day-to-day struggle. And yeah, and this is where like as you're saying, like this as an academic or someone who's like thinking about this stuff and like trying to hold the bigger things and like imagine a strategy forward, it is like holding on. Yeah, what is it? Because the thing is, I would do the same thing.
Hmm.
And how do you then make sure that you don't get caught up in it? And this is the piece I'm like, I understand, as I said, like reading this today, I'm going through all these emotions, I'm digging more into it. I'm like, okay, I understand why this shift in this strategy and why we're now thinking about like, I don't want to call it reform right now. It's basically an attempt to be accepted into a democratic society of Turkey, while essentially also holding the hope that you could push that society more to the left, more into liberation, more into the like creating the world that we all want.
Hmm.
It sucks that it's coming from the right wing and it's coming at a time like this. But yeah, like, and so like for us, how do we make sure that we don't get caught up in it so we don't repeat the same shit and we don't repeat the same like mistakes as those like the Nelson Mandelas or whatever it is. And like,
Hmm.
yeah, this is where I'm going.
I think actually I can tie together a lot of the strands of this conversation because I think in terms of the movements, in terms of the discourse, in terms of like the shifting or sometimes lack of shifting the narrative. So I remember like in 2017, 18, when the US was talking about like quote unquote like pulling out of Kurdish areas and then like or like from north of Syria. And I remember at the time, like the daddy or the one of the biggest figures in the kind of Western left in the anti-imperialist strand, Noam Chomsky, comes out and says that's a terrible idea.
Mm,
And people like jumped because they could not understand. Again, because the only framing is US bad. And so
Hmm.
they couldn't understand in the situation where a guy who's like, to them, his whole shtick, his whole career, his whole analysis is US bad, even though in this moment he's like able to hold the nuance of like, no, because they're facing imminent threats, yeah, from the Turkish state, from Daesh, from a lot of these armed groups that are like super fucking sectarian. And honestly, also kind of remnants of Arab nationalist thought.
mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Like, again, some of the discourse that was coming out, or maybe we had this conversation off recording, vis-a-vis Jordan and Egypt, wherein it's like in response to Trump's like ethnic cleansing plan of pushing out Palestinians into Egypt, their response is no, Egypt is for the Egyptians. And in
Hmm.
that same way that like Syria is for the Syrians. And it's like, no, because you are going to constantly recreate those same tensions and contradictions and violence against
Yeah.
minority communities.
Well, who is
And
Syrian becomes a question of the like, well,
exactly.
only Syrians
Right.
should be at the table, and then they don't invite any of the Kurds.
But then,
Right.
yeah, who are the Syrians? Are they Syrian Arabs? Are they Muslims? Are they, like it starts to get because Arab nationalism is a really bullshit concept that's like never been able to. It's very fluid. It's very vague, like all nationalisms, and it just services a certain group. Regardless,
I don't know about vague, Ayman. I think Arab nationalism is like markedly supremacist and like
Oh yeah.
borders on genocidal in its
Oh no,
practice
I
No,
know. Okay,
absolutely.
repeatedly.
what I mean in terms of vague is like if you see how it's manifested in Iraq under Saddam, than it was manifest in Egypt, like very different. Um, like
Sure. There are
as
a lot of
in,
parallels between Iraq and Syria, manifestation of Arab nationalism, particularly under the Baathists, obviously, but even before then, though.
but yeah, vague may be the wrong word. Maybe it's like fluid,
Yeah,
in terms of then like because again with Iraq, it's like his attempt to sort of blend a kind of geographical nationalism with a Muslim Arab nationalism. It's terrible, it's
mm,
horrible. But it's like, but so one thing that I've been thinking about is I don't talk very much about the fact that I'm from a Druze family. I am Dirze. It's not something that I identify very strongly with or that it influences much of my life or thinking. But very recently, the Israeli state has been engaging in open aggression in Syria and now openly talking about in the protection of the Druze community, which is complete bullshit because the Druze community is not like asking for any of this. But I think connecting with, sorry, maybe this is a weird connection, but I think parts of the strict, a big part of my thesis these days that's in the video essay that hopefully will come out soon is that it's a quote from Edward Said actually, with the walls of Zionism, with the exclusionary racist walls of Zionism came the kind of exclusionary racist walls of Arab nationalism. And so I think Kurds really much so exist in that space wherein, yeah, they're sort of pushed out from that kind of Arab nationalism and so are forced to form kind of pragmatic alliances that they can't afford to have that kind of whatever. Sorry, I don't know if any of that made any sense.
kind of. I might ask you to repeat the Said quote.
Let me find it actually.
Okay. Worth mentioning that Edward Said, in the 80s and 90s, repeatedly denied the gas bombing of Halabja by Saddam Hussein and said that it was a CIA plot. And very much played into the like early stages of campism that we see now of well, if the US says Saddam is bad, then Saddam must be good kind of narrative.
Hmm.
Yeah, I find
Um,
that really disappointing.
I
Yeah.
don't find it shocking though. I will say as a Kurd whose family faced a lot of oppression by Arabs, I don't find it at all shocking. It's disappointing, but certainly not shocking.
Mm.
I mean, yeah, I don't know, man. This is the conversation I feel like me and you, Ayman, had before, where it's like his, he has like the beginnings of critique, but then it stops short and it's essentially left, and the way it's now taken by a lot of people, like as you said, Dîlan, is like really breeds intense campism and
Mm.
itself like cult-like mentality, right? And just basically halts the conversation. And instead of people building on that and critiquing more and building a more nuanced understanding, it's just held at where it was left, you know?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I'm
Yeah.
so glad I'm not the only one who feels that way about Said
Yeah.
work and the way it's engaged with, or like not engaged with, really. It's like sound bites are taken from it and they become like cutesy Instagram fucking posts, and that's kind
Yeah,
of it. That's all that's left.
yeah, yeah.
Um, so much potential, very much halted.
I'm very actually like when we first talked about this, I do want to engage more with these critiques because I've definitely seen critiques of him, but again from other Arabs, and they're kind of or like from people who are more to his left. But basically, what I want to be doing with that kind of looking into Arab nationalism as an ideology, as a project, is we spend a lot of time seeing what our enemies are doing to us, but we don't spend enough time being like, to what are we doing to people? How are we
Mm,
engaged in oppression
hmm.
and in our own systems of domination? And so, like, it's not the easiest thing to do, and I noticed that a lot of Arabs are not willing to do it, where it's like situating yourself in a kind of place of like, I'm not a perfect I'm not just a victim, you know what I mean? I'm a whatever. I've got my own
Like I
shit to
also
figure.
benefit from systems of oppression elsewhere.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
Not just elsewhere, like at home.
No, no,
And
like literally, yeah, not in the diaspora or like
oh
at
yeah.
home.
yeah.
Yeah. But we're not just talking about diaspora populations, obviously, though that's been my overwhelming experience of being like, huh, yes, you're oppressed here, but back home,
Yeah.
you were
Yeah,
rich and
right.
privileged.
Yeah. Let's just forget about that.
And I think we're so well placed to have this conversation, and I just wanted to say I'm so glad to have it because you know, these things are so nuanced, and you know, looking within and having more marginalized voices kind of point out these truths is essential to yeah, like not falling into campism or kind of disrupting those campus narratives that seem so like tidy and clean and black and white, and but you know they're not. So I think it's really important to bring this up.
I think that's the danger of the like limited, very basic engagement with Said's work is that it and like the it reifies a binary of like us versus them. And then
Yeah.
you like align yourself with like the us, and then like the evil them is just like the West.
Yep. Yep.
Um,
Yep.
and like
Yeah.
there's evil on both ends, my friends.
Yeah. It's a lot easier to look at someone else and say you're doing it wrong than to actually look how you're replicating and you're creating the same dynamics, which is really one of the things that drew me to the Kurdish movement was like
Mhm.
that self-reflection piece, the constant looking and reassessing and working the inner work as you do the outer work.
And the like radical imaginary of what can an alternative future look like beyond just
Mm-hmm.
replicating what we had, but with ourselves in power. Like
Mm-hmm.
Algeria is a
Mm-hmm.
great example of a like, oh, let's oust the French and then put ourselves in their same positions and like run the same sort of like violent networks of oppression and control of power that they had, but it's us now.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, and Arab nationalism played a part in that also. Um,
Yeah, because
but
in Algeria they were the LNM were explicitly like part of that kind of Arab nationalist trend.
mhm, mhm. The FLN.
Oh, the FLN, sorry. But
Um,
yeah, same with Syria, same with Iraq, same with whatever.
yeah, and this becomes the question of like when we talk about solidarity in particular, and I will situate myself as someone who's done a lot of like Kurdish liberation solidarity and also engaged in Palestine solidarity. One of the questions that I have not always felt comfortable asking or critiques I've not always felt leveraging is what engagement do we have and what right do we even have, but also what engagement can we have with the methods of the people we're in solidarity with?
Yep.
Is there a dialogue? Is there a discussion? And are we aligning ourselves purely based on a like, well, they're fighting against someone that I think is bad, therefore I'll be in solidarity with them.
Right.
Or aligning ourselves with these people are being genocide, therefore I will be in solidarity with them, which completely logical. Or aligning ourselves with like parties that are like, say, Hamas, who are fighting for the liberation of Palestine. But what does that liberation look like? Like,
Yep.
what did Gaza under Hamas's control look like? How different was that from Iran in the first years of the revolution? When it came to like restrictions on women's freedom and clothing, is there critical engagement with like the groups that we are aligning ourselves with? And this is one of the things where it's like, well, what kind of world are they hoping to build? What kind of
Right.
leadership will it be?
Yep.
What kind of power structure? What will it look like for minorities or for women in particular? And this is one of the things that I appreciate the most about the PKK is their like women's movement, which
Mm.
is like somewhat a separate entity from the PKK at this point.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the big self-reflections that the party under was the establishment and like revolution of the women's movement and the like dedication to women's liberation as a core part of the liberation of people, not as something that will be like pushed aside with and like dealt with after the liberation of the people, which
Yep.
has been the case in Palestine historically. And that becomes a big question for me also of like how are these movements dreaming of a different future? And are they actually dreaming of a different future? Or are they dreaming of replacing those in power with themselves, but maintaining the same power structure? And the PKK does not wish to do that. There is a very like democratic process and orientation and a like very radical imaginary for what different futurities could be, what society can look like beyond how we know it now, and not just accepting that this is the way that it is, but it can be us in the position of power instead, but really challenging the structural dynamics to oppression, the multiple structural dynamics of oppression of peoples, including patriarchy, including capitalist modernity, and the ties between patriarchy, capitalism, and the state, and how they reify each other and work together and depend on each other. And to really dream of an alternative future means confronting the three of them, not just one or another.
I'm immediately thinking about I forgot which one of his writings this was in, but when he was talking about the first colonization beyond the land was the colonization of the female body and how impactful that was because and like now I talk about that all the time when I talk to people who are like starting to engage in this stuff or like want to know what I'm doing and like why I think about what I'm thinking about. I was like, well, or like what is it like, right? Like we have to just worry about what's happening right now and how do we move beyond the reactionary. I was like being able to hold all these little things together, as difficult as it is critical in us being able to actually move forward in and seeing and creating new ways of things emerging, right? Because none of us know. I generally don't believe that any of us could imagine a liberated world in this moment, just because our imagination has been impacted and our abilities and our tactics and even just the possibilities are all impacted. But at least naming this stuff and knowing it and seeing how they're all tied together, I think opens up the field so much more, and like sows the field in a way that allows us to sprout new seeds, you know? Um, and Öcalan's writing and the movement, the Kurdish movement itself, and specifically, like you said, Delani, the genealogy branch of the movement is like so beyond interesting to me. It's like so fundamental, and like I think that they are representative of what I think like our movements are the process that we should all be going through, right? Like they're the process of kill the male ego, the takmil process, these things that are about how we relate to each other, how we hold space with each other, how do we decondition what we think we know in order to create new possibilities. Yeah, and if honestly, I think if there's any movement that could try to integrate into a state and push it forward, I think they have the tools, they've been building the tools, and they've been engaged in the practice of these tools for all these years. And they're an investment and a commitment to this self-reflection and these practices that I think it might be possible that you could push a state like Turkey into a new way. So I don't know. I guess I'm finding my excitement for the possibilities.
I mean, I hope so also, and I'm trying to say like cautiously optimistic.
Yeah.
And I think that the call itself comes from a place of restriction, and like the power dynamics at play are obviously to be considered of like you are coming up against the state that is the arbiter of power and violence and control. And this is like the hand that is being dealt, and there's like some agency there, but limited, right? Like restricted agency. It's not full agency.
Hmm. Hmm.
And there has been a lot of groundwork laid towards the building of democratic society. And there's, restrictions on like how that ball is being put into Turkey's court, for lack of better wording.
Hmm.
But we also have to keep in mind that like Turkey has jailed the majority of Kurdish politicians and journalists.
Yeah.
Demirtas, for example, who released the statement today in support of Öcalan's statement.
Hmm.
Selahattin Demirtas, who was the like former co-chair of the HDP, who was like jailed in 2016 for having ties to the PKK, and in May of last year was sentenced to 42 years in prison. So the Turkish state has a long-standing practice of talking about peace talks to like distract and then like do more power grabs and enact more violence,
Hmm.
and then like removes elected Kurds from positions that they've been democratically elected to, and appointing AKP trustees in their place to assert more control over like Kurdish regions, and regions of organizing and regions of like unrest. And there have been attempts at like pushing beyond the like dual power formations of democratic organizing within Kurdistan of Turkey. Cizre is an example, like the city of Cizre that like declared themselves semi-autonomous and then was like raised by the Turkish state 2015, 2016.
Yeah.
And what's the like phrasing for this? You're in like such a shit position negotiating wise
Oh yeah.
You're essentially backed up against a wall with like guns pointing at you, and like you may have a handgun and can do like a quick draw and fire, or you try to like bargain and negotiate. And it seems to be that's like the positioning of, I mean, I don't want to say that actually. The negotiating position that Kurds find themselves in repeatedly is of disenfranchisement, because they are not given a seat at the table. They're not granted a seat at the table. There have been attempts to like build their own table and have their own way of doing things, so that like they don't have to deal with, and the state doesn't have to deal with them, which have repeatedly been shut down and like violently suppressed. And the like the power dynamics of these peace talks, all of the peace talks, from the ones with the PKK and Öcalan and the Turkish state to the peace talks in Palestine
Mm.
over the years, are ones of unequal power share. And what kind of actual, dialogue can you have when there's a gun pointing at one of the parties and the other party is holding that gun? And Israa, you said something about Turkey as a colonial power and the like neo-Ottoman fetishism.
Mm.
Um, and like I can't help but think of Artsakh, um, and Azeri aggression into Armenia as an extension of this, and as like being embodied or emboldened by Turkish aggressions and supported by the Turkish state and
Mm.
Israeli drones,
Hmm.
and weapons. And the narratives, the like public narratives of the Turkish state in support of the Palestinians, and Iran does this also, and Saddam did this also. Saddam did it in at like particular times when he was like not very popular, to muster up Arab nationalist, pan-Arabist sort of support. Palestinians get used as a like prop in a
Yeah.
like, shitty game of 3D chess.
Yeah.
And like I don't want this region to be a shitty game of 3D chess. Where is the agency of the pieces and of the players? It shouldn't be
Yeah.
just like a couple of people playing. And there is some agency, and the PKK really embodies the agency that you can have in the face of like state repression, and like dreaming for something beyond the confines of the game that you are pushed into play. But the irony of Turkey uh, calling for an end to genocide in Gaza and the end to bombardments while doing the same thing in Kurdish areas, and has been doing the same thing in Kurdish areas for so long, is not lost on us.
Yeah.
Um, and continuing to buy weapons from Israel and trying to hide it.
I like the kind of the drawing the parallel between like Kurdish self-determination and like Artsakh Armenian self-determination, and with Turkey having having playing such a major role in the oppression and subjugation of peoples that challenge its hegemony in the region. And I'm curious to see, I mean, one thing that I appreciate you saying is like this is definitely, a practicing of agency and maneuvering in a really constrained space that I think, and this is a topic for another episode, but the Armenians not having done that, and you could argue that Artsakh was lost as a result of not doing that, and not kind of looking at the cards that you are dealt, and doing what you can to preserve what you have. But I would be curious to see moving forward what sort of real concessions Turkey is able to give, even though we can kind of see it does have the upper hand here. But just in terms of addressing historical ongoing oppression, ensuring cultural and political rights for Kurds in the country, these are unfortunately things I'm not that, I wish I was more optimistic about. But, because we're talking about things about, providing meaningful autonomy, is this just not something that Turkey will be willing to do? But, beyond that, there's other places that it could do a little bit of justice, but again, my expectations are low. Justice for victims of the conflict, all those people have lost their lives, homes, communities in the conflict. Justice in the legal system, right? You mentioned, the thousands of Kurdish politicians, activists, journalists, ordinary citizens that have been imprisoned under Turkey's broad anti-terror laws, judicial reforms and all that. What is that going to look like? Well, what are we getting in
Mhm.
exchange for this?
Hundreds of thousands of people disappeared.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. One of the things that makes me think of Artsakh a lot, when it comes to this, is the again the relationship to land and how people relate to it differently. say Artsaksis relating to the land versus Azeris relating to the land. And the same goes for like Kurds in areas that they've lived for a very long time, and the state wanting to have an extractive relationship with the land, extracting for resources in particular. And I don't think that there is ever enough discussion about the beyond the like genocidal nationalist narratives and reasons for invading Artsakh and colonizing and incursions into Armenia and also into like northern Syria and different parts of Kurdish areas of Turkey as well. A lot of it is economically motivated. Like there are like gas and oil pipelines at stake.
Yeah.
There are like minerals to be mined, or minerals that they want to mine for economic reasons. And the drive of like capitalist aim plays a huge role in these like nationalist narratives, but a like non-explicit one as well.
Okay. We've covered quite a lot of ground. Sort of just aiming towards time and like thinking of wrapping up. Are there any sort of final comments or thoughts?
One thing that comes to mind is there will likely be a party congress of the PKK in the like next few months. This process is going to be a like long-term process. I know there's a lot of like very eye-catching headlines about, the PKK has like the leader has called for disbanding and disarming. But this is not going to be an overnight process, and I don't even think it will happen in a year if it does. And that there will need to be a party congress to determine the next steps, absolutely. But there haven't really been any concrete actions from the Turkish state in regards to the statement. And other than the statement of unilateral ceasefire, there haven't been actions by the PKK either. So we will see what happens. I'm very curious to see what happens. It's a interesting development, pivotal moment in the history of the PKK and the like relations with the Turkish state, and also of the region. I mean, the PKK is active in all four parts of Kurdistan, and in different ways. And the SDF leader Muslim Abdi did say that the call for laying down arms does not apply to them, which is also important to note because they are not the PKK, and they are now functioning just like within Syria. They only function within Syria, so the call does not apply to them. And yeah, we'll see what happens. Maybe there'll be a part 2 to this at some point.
I think for me, I just want, I guess, encourage people to kind of process the emotions that comes up with something like this and to think about strategies and tactics and like being fluid in the face of empire and in the face of end stage capitalism and climate crisis and be open to the possibilities. And I think this conversation is actually allowing me to kind of move through that a lot more. And so like my initial anxieties are a lot less intense right now. And I am finding a lot more curiosity about the possibilities. And it is reminding me of like, we can't just focus on one tactic or one strategy and say that's it. We have to be willing to try different things while holding like the long vision in our dreams, and be continuously working and seeing what emerges and adjusting from there.
Okay. Well, thank you, Dîlan. Thank you for joining us. Karen and Israa as well, of course, and thank you, listener, for listening. Of course, the Fire These Times is community supported, and so if you want to help this podcast, if you enjoyed this podcast or appreciate the work we do from the periphery as a whole, please consider checking out our Patreon with the links below and become a monthly member. So with that said, thank you so much, Dîlan. This was an incredible, very wide, thorough conversation, and I really appreciated it.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thank you.